Well, I'll get started. My name is Joseph Garcia. I'm an adjunct professor in Chicana and Chicano Studies. I also work for the New Mexico State Legislature as a senior policy analyst in education. This presentation, I'm trying to look at three different areas of my life and work connected to Latin America. What I'm looking at here, the title is actually a paper I'm working on publishing through the Third World journal, Juntas de Saneamiento in the Struggle for Water, the Catholic Church, the Peace Corps, and the World Bank-IDB in rural Paraguay. But I'm also giving you a broader understanding of my life because I was recently featured in a national spot for Peace Corps celebrating diversity and the 60th anniversary of the Peace Corps, founded in 1961. And myself and I think 6 or 8 other persons are in that video. You can look it up or I can send it out if need be. I was also interviewed, an hour-and-a-half interview. There's a oral history project, Peace Corps oral history project. And so I was interviewed also in 2020 for the 60th anniversary. It's through the University of Kentucky. And so this is a combination of presentations about my work, my experience in the Peace Corps as a Chicano Latino volunteer, giving you a little bit of background about myself and the preparation for Peace Corps for my life, which I think has been interesting, if not eventful. Talking about the project, which is the title of this presentation, and then looking at being Chicano, teaching in Chicano Studies, teaching in actually 3 different institutions, teaching at Union College as a postdoc in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, as well as on the Texas-Mexican border in Laredo, where my family's from, or at least one part of my family, teaching sociology and history, and the interesting culmination of circumstances, conditions that leads me to New Mexico. And so I finished a PhD in Latin American Studies in 2015 at UNM. I also completed in 2006 a dual degree master's in Community Regional Planning and Latin American Studies, which is what this presentation is based off of and what I've been working on for a number of years, and most recently the last 5 years with 2 professors to get published. And so I begin with contested spaces in the Americas. I look at the Southwest, where we're at, looking at the contested space of the US Southwest, Texas independence, the Mexican-American War, to give context, and examining how that is the same in South America. On the right side of the picture is Paraguay, also a contested space. Not about the same time, but a few years later, you have the Triple Alliance War, in terms of where half of the territory of Paraguay is taken away by the Brazilians and the Argentinians, as well as the Uruguayans. The same thing happens in the United States in regards to the US Southwest. Half of Mexico's territory is taken by war. And these are both places rich in resources. And in Paraguay sits like Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, and part of Bolivia over the Guarani Aquifer, which is shown here. Or I'll be showing here in a little bit in this map. So keep in mind the contested space of the US Southwest, Texas included, and the contested space in South America, especially Paraguay, which sits right in the middle between Uruguay, Bolivia, and Brazil and Argentina. And what that means in terms of the development of people from these places, of different ethnic backgrounds. And so a quick outline. I'm going to look at voting rights in rural Texas, which my parents were involved in, which I was involved in the 80s as a teenager. Look at the water struggles in Paraguay, the connections between the organizing I grew up in and part of, as well as the work I did in the Peace Corps, the connections, but also showing a historical interest in regards to the broader history of the Americas. And here on the left, you have this picture of on the Texas Trail of Cabeza de Vaca. And Cabeza de Vaca is an interesting character who goes from Florida all the way to Texas, all the way into New Mexico, and then eventually into Mexico and connects back with the Spanish Empire. But for a long period of time, he was in Texas and in New Mexico and became kind of a shaman, a healer, and then became kind of and wrote about his experiences. And these experiences are prior Europeanization of Texas and New Mexico. So it gives us an understanding. There's a number of faculty or folks who have written about this, and especially this book here, Peter Laurie, which I haven't read. I've read another book actually, which is most recent. But the other thing about Cabeza de Vaca is Cabeza de Vaca goes back to Spain celebrated. He becomes kind of a champion for indigenous rights. But he also ends up in South America as the viceroy for Rio de la Plata in the Argentine, Paraguayan, Uruguay area, but runs afoul and ends up sent back to Spain in chains. And so, not to compare myself to Cabeza de Vaca, but I have had this kind of interesting experience also growing up in Texas or being in Texas, as well as going to Paraguay and the Peace Corps and the historical interesting experiences of different people. I'm of mixed background. You know, I supposedly, in terms of the DNA study that was done of me, which some people agree with, some people don't. I'm 24% Native American, 59% European, and 9 to 10% North African, plus or minus a percentage, I guess, 3 or 4% difference. And so this is the other thing that I'm examining in terms of the part of the experience, the American experience, or so to speak, and how we each have our own lineage, backgrounds, experiences, and conditions. And so these are my mother and father in 1969 when they were married. This is a paper that I have published in the Journal of South Texas History called Insurgent Organizing, García versus the City of Taft, Texas, which is about voting rights and more in terms of the small, relatively nowhere community of Taft, Texas that I grew up in, about 20 miles northwest of Corpus Christi. This is my father, almost a year after coming back from the toughest fighting of the Vietnam War. He was an elite Marine, he was a recon Marine, 3rd Marines, 3rd Division, Lima Company. He was a part of an elite group called Ripley's Raiders. And so he was a highly trained soldier, and wasn't necessarily proud of what he did in Vietnam, but he was proud to be a Marine and raised me and my younger brother, who also has a PhD, to be as Marines for the 15 years we knew him. He died in 1985 from leukemia that we think he contracted through Agent Orange, being that the U.S. government sprayed billions of gallons of deforesting poisons and other defoliants, which we now see Roundup as being proven to cause cancer, but I won't get into those details. And this is my mother. My father is 25 at the time. My mother is 29. My mother's the youngest of 10. My father is the middle child of a family of 11. Both of their grandfathers are from Mexico, but their grandmothers on both sides are from Texas, of a long lineage of Native American as well, or indigenous, as well as European background. And so from Vietnam to voting rights, my father dies in 1985, and before the decision is handed out in a voting rights case that they win in 1989. My father began organizing in the late 70s, early 80s after we returned from Germany, because my father worked for Reynolds Aluminum. I did my first year of study at a German international school. And my parents started organizing. My mother was from the community of Taft. My father was from a community about 30 miles north, Beeville. And they began being highly involved in the Catholic Church, actually doing retreats, leadership retreats through the Catholic Church, as well as working with the GI Forum, with the VFW. My father started the VFW chapter in the town, and basically kind of created a semi-paramilitary group, not necessarily with weapons, but to support each other in terms of organizing. Then through the Catholic Church, the GI Forum, LULAC, and the VFW, they began organizing and transforming this community that was used a variety of voter suppression methods, which now are part and parcel and become legal in the state of Texas, to limit participation of the mostly Mexican American, but also African-American populations. And so my father arrived from Vietnam in 1968 after how do I say it, fighting in some of the toughest battles, actually probably the toughest battle during the Tet Offensive. If you're familiar with the Vietnam War, my father was in the Battle of Hue, which was basically urban warfare or urban style guerrilla warfare. So he was fearless in his return to Texas, which he had grown up in the 40s and 50s, and saw a lot of violence against Mexican Americans and African Americans, which there are a number of faculty or professors that have written about these things. And so to kind of highlight what influences me into going into the Peace Corps, studying at an advanced level, teaching at different institutions, and now engaged in policy work in the state of New Mexico in terms of secondary education. Once I also have taught at the secondary level besides the university level. In fact, last year I taught 8th grade science in the junior high and school that I grew up in Taft, Texas, which is still a very isolated community, 98% Mexican American, but still operates with schools that were built in the 1950s, where the other communities around us, which are of larger white Euro-American populations, have brand new schools or relatively new schools and great funding. But Taft remains, because of what they call white flight, kind of an isolated, mostly Mexican American community in South Texas, like there are many that operate with limited budgets and how do I say it? Substandard schooling, substandard infrastructure and resources. Sorry about that. So from revolution to civil rights, to the civil rights revolution, and I'm not going to cover this in detail, but to kind of give you a general picture, for my dissertation research, I covered the major revolutions of the Americas, specifically the Mexican and Cuban revolutions, and the way that they confronted U.S. foreign policy, which led to the development of the Peace Corps, the Cold War against the Soviet Union, the Russian Revolution, against the Chinese Revolution. And so I'm going to focus on Latin America, independence and revolution, and the different populations that were engaged in these social movements, which brings me to the U.S. civil rights movement in the 1960s, which is heavily influential in terms of the Chicana and Chicano movements, which my parents were kind of in the middle of, but not well-known activists. But what they did was supported by and worked with people from the Chicano movement, examining, in terms of the influence of voter suppression, which is all the rage in the U.S. South and other parts of the United States. And is the United States really a democracy? And do we really promote the democratic institutions or democracy around the world? And so, in terms of the case in regards to my parents, the 1965 Voting Rights Act was only for the Deep South. It did not cross into Texas or go other parts of the United States. It did not cover New York. It did not cover the state of Washington or Texas or Arizona or New Mexico. And so this was a limitation that is seen by very influential congresspersons as well as others who are not in politics, so to speak. And in 1975, you have the extension of the Voting Rights Act, the first extension, that is sponsored by Barbara Jordan, the legendary Houston congressional representative, Germán Valdillo, who is the Puerto Rican congressional representative from the Bronx, unless I'm wrong, but I think he's from the Bronx. And you have Edward Roybal, who's born in New Mexico, but is a congressional representative from Los Angeles area. I think East LA. I could be wrong, but certainly LA. And so they're the ones who sponsor, with the support of MALDEF, LULAC, NAACP, a number of organizations, to extend the Voting Rights Act throughout the country, but specifically the U.S. Southwest, to include Native Americans, African Americans, and Mexican Americans into voting. And so I think this is pivotal in history that isn't necessarily addressed, but extremely important in terms of the development of democracy in the United States, as well as this whole push for democracy in other parts of the world. And so the combination of these movements in the 20th century, civil rights, you name it, the Second World War, the New Deal, etc., lead to the Peace Corps, for better or for worse. Because this presentation isn't going to be glowing in terms of the Peace Corps being the end-all be-all. It has its warts and it has its issues, and I saw those as a Peace Corps volunteer, as well as beyond being a Peace Corps volunteer. Afterwards, I was a Peace Corps recruiter full-time in the Dallas office for 2 years, as well as I was a campus recruiter for the Peace Corps for 2 years that paid for my master's study at UNM, when there was a what they call a strategic campus recruiter at UNM until 2012, I guess, or something of that nature. And so this is the experience I have in terms of growing up, the son of civil rights organizers, activists. I grew up meeting with professors, with lawyers from the Mexican American Legal and Educational Defense Fund, as well as going to city council meetings, school board meetings, engaging with different organizations, LULAC, the GI Forum, and things and other organizations that my parents were connected to, the NAACP. And so again, Vietnam War and the social transformation. The Vietnam War is extremely important in transforming this country. Major uprisings, protests in the 1960s. My father comes back to Texas. He's been wounded twice. He received actually a bullet wound to the forehead that he survived off of a ricocheting bullet. He suffered from PTSD. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, and met my mother and got married. And over the 1970s, slowly overcame a lot of the issues of growing up extremely impoverished, but also suffering from the unsupported, untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and TBI, the traumatic brain injury from not just the bullet wound to the forehead, but also being in combat. So he dies in 1985 when I'm the age of 15. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know. And so this I'm segueing now into my Peace Corps experience of why I joined the Peace Corps and the experience of being the son of civil rights, voting rights organizers, and how that played in terms of influencing me going into the Peace Corps. And the whole interesting experience I had, which is also just as memorable in terms of the upbringing I had growing up in Texas in the 70s and 80s. And so I'll continue on. And so the title of this presentation, Juntas de Saneamiento in the Struggle for Water, examines not just me or not my role, but the communities in central Paraguay where I served. This is a map of Paraguay. This is in blue is the Guarani Aquifer, which is the largest freshwater aquifer in the world, that at that time in 1997 to 1999, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, had barely been tapped into. And it basically where I don't know if you can see the cursor, but right there is roughly where I was a Peace Corps volunteer, right kind of in the southern part of Paraguay. And you drill 200 meters down into the water, and you have into the earth, into the ground, and you have some of the best, cleanest water. I can attest to this because we drilled a 143-meter well and hit a pocket of water that was basically able to pump out roughly 20,000 liters per hour, I believe, or minute, I forget. But 20,000 liters of water that was tested and was found to be extremely clean and did not need to be treated. And so I'm this volunteer in this rural community. This is 1997, 1998. Ends up being a very tumultuous time during the history of Paraguay, as well as other parts of Latin America or South America. Here in this picture are some young women dancing in front of a school. Paraguayans are very proud. They're very, a lot of folks don't travel to Paraguay. Paraguay isn't like Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, or Peru, or other places, Colombia, where they have amazing natural geography, features, animals, jungle. I mean, there's certainly a large amount of jungle, and there is a lot to see in Paraguay. But the whole place is relatively flat, some rolling hills, but you don't get a lot of tourists because it's a landlocked country, and because for many, many years it was under a very brutal dictatorship. and is still under the same party that supported the dictatorship, the Colorados, which are very right-wing. Here below, you see the Iguazu Falls, Iguazu, E in Guarani, which I speak not fluently anymore, but almost. Iguazu, is water, Iguazu, big water, or big waterfalls, so to speak. And so here is also a map to show you where Paraguay lies in terms of the milieu of South America. And so rural Paraguayan community and the Peace Corps. The community I'm sent into is first colonized in the 1960s in terms of the Stroessner dictatorship, trying to lessen the pressures of urban explosion, urban growth, urbanization. And so in various ways, provides some support, but also forces campesinos in the Asunción area to move out into the hinterlands, which are lands that are, native indigenous lands. The different Guarani tribes, Bua, Chamacoco, other groups of indigenous people, mostly Guarani speaking. I lived actually in this village behind this church, this capilla of Guayaquicuá, the community that I lived in. Guayaquicuá is a derogatory Guarani word for the Ache tribe, which are fierce warriors that were known to possibly be cannibals, but also were known to fight very fiercely to protect their lands. And behind this church is the Reserva Guarani, or this big reserve where you had Bila Guarani communities living, which I was able to go to with people from the community. I was trained in Guarani and mostly spoke Guarani, or Chopara, the mixture of Guarani and Spanish, which is what they call it in Paraguay. And so I lived with campesino families in this village of roughly 1,000 people. Slowly, I was trained in Guarani, but it took me, maybe 6 months or a little bit longer to really learn it. Just like the community I grew up in Taft, Texas, the Catholic Church was important. Actually, part of the organizing that my parents did was through an Irish priest from the Northern Irish Republic borderlands, Father Letty, who was a huge influence on my parents in terms of organizing and social justice. I remember Father Letty very well. And that was an interesting experience growing up in Taft, Texas, which actually sits in the county of San Patricio, which was founded by the Irish in the 1820s, 1830s. And I ended up growing up, formidable years in the 1980s with an Irish priest, Father Letty. And so in this village that I served in, very Catholic, not everybody, of course, the ruling party, the Colorados, were not necessarily Catholic. They sent their kids and their wives to church, but they wouldn't go because of the historical animosity between the dictatorship, the Colorado Party, and the Catholic Church, which was the main opposition to the Catholic Church, or one of the main opposition institutions. But in the community were Franciscan nuns. And there were a group of 4 Franciscan nuns who were a strong presence. And so the uniqueness of Guayaquicuá is that this was a kind of a central community that, as I've said before, was colonized in the 1960s, and you had displaced persons displacing indigenous populations. And so I was a verse volunteer in this village, but I entered into an interesting circumstance where a few months before I arrived, there was an attempted assassination by a local party boss of one of the leading Franciscan nuns, whose name is Maxima Vera. So she was quite a strong person, didn't take no for an answer. And when they tried to burn her in her house, she immediately went to the Archbishop of Paraguay, who pressured the president of Paraguay to send out a new police force. The other thing about Guayaquicuá was that it had a police station in this rural community about 40 kilometers north of a major city, Caguasu, in the state of Caguasu. Caguasu means large forest. Ca'a, forest or trees. Guasu, just like Iguazu Falls, big. And so the municipal project that I worked on, I was a basic volunteer. Not much was expected of me. I basically built latrines with families. and did other kind of simple gardening and agricultural projects. But then my second year, we were approached by the Paraguayan government and our Peace Corps director, health director, who wanted us to be a part of these projects. I wrote a grant in Spanish, worked with the community. We organized a water commission and submitted this grant 4 times. It was rejected 3 times and accepted on the 4th time for a variety of reasons, complications that I go into in the paper. And so this project was built in 1998, 1999. During the middle of this project, there was the assassination of the vice president of Paraguay, Argaña, who had been the president or the leader of the Paraguayan Supreme Court during the 35-year Stroessner dictatorship. He had been brought in to be vice president because of corruption and because the candidate of that faction of the Colorado Party was put in jail for an attempted coup in the 1990s. And he became the vice president, and people had to go through him for decisions to be made, and he became very powerful. He became annoying to who knows what faction, and was eliminated in 1999, March of 1999, which ends up becoming called the Marzo Paraguayo, that ends up in the death of roughly 19 to 20 young men in and around the plaza, the congressional plaza of Asunción, Paraguay, the capital. And so this is the Marzo Paraguayo during the construction of this running water system. So, I entered this community where people had been killed by the party or party bosses or their underlings, as well as the attempted assassination of the nun, as well as the Marzo Paraguayo, as you see in the right picture, on the right side of the picture, in terms of the protests that happened, that interesting enough brought together students and campesinos to rise up and force actually the collapse of the government. The Cubas government, Cubas Argaña government, Argaña was eliminated, and you had the transition of power that happened. On the left here, you have Stroessner, Paz, Democracia, Libertad, which was the mantra of the Stroessner dictatorship, and Stroessnistas, which to this day exist and wish Stroessner was still in power, but in a way he still is, because his party that he was instrumental in developing and using to support himself is still in power, and seizing indigenous lands and campesino lands at will, with the support of the Bolsonaro government. Interesting enough, Bolsonaro was just set himself up to be recognized for an indigenous award, but yet also said that the Ukraine war gave him the right to seize lands in the Amazon. Interesting tidbit there. And so community and project challenges, working with community, Paraguayan government, NGOs, and the Peace Corps on this project. This was neoliberal development at its finest, basically building this running water system, trying to get the running water system to be accepted in terms of the grant. It was an $84,000 project. There was corruption issues in it. I wasn't necessarily involved in, but I was made aware of them during the construction of the project, in the sense that there was a contractors mafia that was doling out who got the projects, and bribes were paid to do that because, of course, it's a small country, limited number of contractors, and the process was not, how do I say it, professional. At the same time, you have massive agro industry that is entering Paraguay from Brazil, specifically supported by the Brazilian government and the Paraguayan government, displacing campesinos, in the sense of they would certainly pay the campesinos top dollar for their land, but yet the Paraguayan campesinos would go to Asunción or other major cities, and within a very short time would lose their wealth, and because they had known a certain way of life. There was no transition support, there was no training, there was no education, there was no work training, you name it. And so this is the thing that is happening and beginning in the 1990s with the end of the Stroessner dictatorship in 1989. And at the same time in the 1980s, roughly 1980, you have at the time the largest hydroelectric dam built on the Brazilian-Paraguayan border. You have another one, Yacyretá, which is built on the Argentinian-Paraguayan border, that mostly supply electricity to the Argentinians and the Brazilians. And so not very far away from these hydroelectric dams, specifically Itapúa on the Brazilian-Paraguayan border, the Paraguayans were not getting support or getting any type of services from that dam. And the village that I lived in didn't get electricity until the mid-1990s, and then finally gets running water, or a running water system in 1999, number of years later, that to this day is still in operation, thankfully. But it's not because of me. It's because of the dedication of the people of Paraguay, the campesinos, and specifically the focus of the paper, which is the juntas, and the junta system that has been lauded by the Inter-American Development Bank, other organizations, and was featured in a 2016 Guardian, UK Guardian article, to where now roughly 94% of rural communities in Paraguay have access to water and access to sanitation through the Juntas de Saneamiento. I don't know, I forget where the idea of it comes from. It's an old idea. I've actually spoken to the former president of the Inter-American Development Bank, who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, who did a lot of research, study, and travel in Latin America, and was familiar also with the Juntas de Saneamiento. And so this model is somewhat of a model that's gone worldwide, so to speak, to provide local communities, for better for worse. It has its issues in terms of organizing the communities to provide clean potable water and access to sanitation, which is extremely important because I think over more than 80% of the world does not have access to potable water. I forget the number, I used to know it. It'll come to me maybe later. And so the other component that I get into in Texas and Paraguay, growing up in Texas and Paraguay, is the challenges for democracy and the rule of law in the Americas, which is part of this Juntas de Saneamiento, in terms of creating commissions, engaging in civic participation in local communities, to where, for example, in Texas, the history of Jim Crow has kept a large portion of the population out of the process. Civic participation, political participation, even being neighborly, or having connections and knowing who your neighbors are, which is also part of this interesting project, not comparing Texas to Paraguay, so to speak, but yet US foreign policy in terms of democracy promotion and the rule of law. Because, interesting enough, there's this sign here that says Primer Comunidad in this left picture, or my left, libre de abigeato gracias al esfuerzo mancomando de sus pobladores y la Policía Nacional, in terms of when this attempted assassination of Hermana Maxima happens, you get a new police force gets brought in. You get national attention to this community and to this region. And so there's a kind of quasi cleanup process that actually allows people from opposition parties, mostly Catholic, very strongly Catholic, to start taking a stronger role in the communities, especially with the Franciscan nuns being involved. And then I arrived. And I didn't know all the complications that were happening in Paraguay, let alone the community of Guayaquipa. But I have my inklings that I was sent there in a way to be kind of, I'm 6'1" at the time, roughly 200 pounds. I'm a little bit heavier now. To be some kind of, not necessarily a straight up security detail for the Franciscan nuns, but to be a presence in that community, as it was under the microscope of the Paraguayan government. My health director, Pedro Sosa, who had worked for a long time in the Paraguayan government, especially the Ministry of Health, knew what he was doing in terms of sending different volunteers to different places, so to speak. I wouldn't agree with everything he did, but I have to say I had a remarkable, amazing experience in the Peace Corps in Guayaquipa. And so the other component is the interesting dynamics of Peace Corps as an institution, working with the Paraguayan government, but also growing up in Texas and seeing the institutions at work in Texas to limit participation, seeing the institutions in Paraguay to limit participation, civic participation, but yet growing up in the 70s and 80s in my parents' case, and in the town I'm from, seeing the development of participation, greater civic participation, that since then has been stymied and is now, really being attacked, not just in Texas, not just in Paraguay, but in many places around the world. And so this is what we're looking at. This is the bus that I would go in and out of Guayaquipa, which is roughly a 45-minute bus ride. these young gentlemen are from the village. This one gentleman on the right side, who is the chauffeur, the driver, his brother was, and his brother and his brother's wife were my main partners, my main people who I relied on and worked with a great deal, and were extremely instrumental in my experience in the Peace Corps. Actually, I just got a message from the director of schools, Cristina Gonzalez, who I still remain in contact with. And so the World Bank IDB Paraguayan government project, as I said before, the institutions, their role in limiting participation, limiting access to resources, as well as opening up spaces in both cases. Unfortunately, I'm not in line with the neoliberal models. They're actually collapsing now. But yet, it's a very complicated situation in terms of US foreign policies, foreign and domestic, and the way they blend. We present something internationally, but we don't live up to those principles and standards here in the United States. And so this is the project when we inaugurated it. If you can see in the picture, there's a gentleman to my, let's see if he's looking at the screen. To my right is John McCloskey, who is the country director, who has returned within the last year to Peace Corps, as well as on the left side is the governor of Caguasu at the time, whose name escapes me, but then all the other gentlemen, unfortunately, there were mostly men that worked on the Juntas de Saneamiento, because of the way that Paraguay is kind of a very, how do I say it, macho, paternalistic country. But yet, Professor Director Cristina Gonzalez was very instrumental, very much a leader in the community because of her role as the principal of the schools. And I also taught in the high school there, science, health and English for a school year. And so that's roughly the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can also email me any questions. If you have any questions at all, please find me. You can find me in the Chicana and Chicano Studies directory, or you can email me through UNM at mboravi@unm.edu, which is my Guarani nickname they gave me, Boravi. I actually misspelled it. Yeah, I put Mboravi, but it's actually Mboravi, which is the Guarani word for the tapir. And so that's been my email for the last 20 years, as well as my, you can find my Hotmail, or you can email me through the State of New Mexico, State Legislature of New Mexico. And please let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. Let's see, let me go into the chat here. Thank you, David. David Rogers is participating. He was also in Paraguay, in Caguasu in the 1980s. He knows John McCloskey. David is the executive director for Dual Language New Mexico, and I've most recently met him in the last 6 months. And he knows very well Paraguay, and spent actually a lot more time in Paraguay than I did, especially during the fall of the dictatorship, and lived during the dictatorship. And so thank you very much, David. Thank you for participating, also Kevin and others.